Good morning. I'm Bob Cusack. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Hill. I want to welcome you to the Rayburn House Office building. We're also live streaming on thehill.com. I want to thank the Capitol Forum for co-hosting this event with us, and you can feel free to join the conversation on Twitter at The Hill Events or at Capitol_Forum using the hashtag Puerto Rico Forum. Both the Capitol Forum and The Hill thought this issue merits more attention than it's been getting, and that's why we're having this discussion with the congressman as well as two expert panels. I do want to introduce the congressman. Congressman Pedro Pierluisi has been Puerto Rico's sole member of Congress, known as a resident commissioner since January 2009. He represents 3.5 million U.S. citizens, the most of any member of the U.S. House of Representatives, and is a member of the Judiciary and the Natural Resources Committee. Please welcome the congressman.
I'm not sure this is on.
Is that working?
Let me see.
Do
you hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. So thank you so much, Bob.
Oh, no, absolutely.
For
Thanks for coming. The first question I want to ask is, why is this issue so important, and what is the situation on the ground in Puerto Rico?
There is a crisis in Puerto Rico, both economic and fiscal, dating back on the economic front about 10 years. On the fiscal side, I'd say we lost access to the markets at a reasonable price or cost about a year and a half or so ago. Mm-hmm. And that's a serious issue because right now, for example, our government is facing serious liquidity issues. Our government every year used to get what's called trans-financing tax and revenue anticipation notes, basically borrowing on a very short-term basis while taxes and duties and other revenues are not yet coming in. Mm-hmm. And you do that every year. This year, the government was unable to do it. And that's why you're talking about the possibility of furloughs, the possibility of not paying debt, not defaulting on bond payments. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about that. So that's the immediate crisis. The background, though, is that Puerto Rico as a territory has been seriously underfunded for ages in key programs such as Medicaid. Just enhancing the Medicaid funding Puerto Rico gets on a yearly basis would improve the financial wherewithal of our government, and we wouldn't be talking about a crisis, at least on the fiscal side, the way we are.
Mm-hmm. Well, and is it getting more dire, and what if policymakers don't intervene? What will happen? Because a lot of people are leaving.
That has been happening, again, now for about a decade. We lost more than 300,000 Puerto Ricans, American citizens, mm-hmm. In that period of time. That's unprecedented. It's the largest migration within the U.S. in recent memory, and in Puerto Rico ever since the 50s or 40s and 50s. Mm-hmm. You cannot grow the economy, losing population at the tune of about 2% a year, 2 to 3%. So that's a challenge. Mm-hmm. Why are they leaving? That's the question. The answer is pretty obvious. They're looking for jobs. They're looking for better quality of life in the States. They can hop on a plane from one day to the next and go to Florida, Texas, the Carolinas, the Northeast. And it's unfortunate because sometimes you're talking about people who want to work, productive people. And we need them back. We need mm-hmm. them back home.
What about the critics who've compared Puerto Rico to Greece? A lot of them are Republicans, don't support the bill that you've introduced on Chapter 9 bankruptcy. They say this has just been fiscally irresponsible by the Puerto Rico government.
First of all, we need to keep in mind that Puerto Rico is not a foreign country. This is not like sovereign debt. This is not like a problem you can ignore. You have it within your country. You're talking about American citizens. And again, when looking at the problem of Puerto Rico, you have to realize that, for example, all these bonds that Puerto Rico floated, issued, were bought in the municipal markets in the U.S., municipal bond markets. People, individuals, funds, pension funds from the mainland as well as from Puerto Rico bought these bonds. And so you should all be concerned about the stability of the municipal bond market. You should also be concerned about Puerto Rico's viability, long-term viability. It's not like you can all of a sudden from one day to the next say, okay, you no longer are American citizens or you no longer are a U.S. territory. Life doesn't work like that. So that's why we need attention. Chapter 9, since you mentioned it, it's one example. The life of a territory is that many times we get left out from federal legislation. Usually we do not get left out when we're talking about environmental requirements, banking laws, federal criminal law enforcement. We have all those regulations applying in Puerto Rico, which is good, by the way. But we are left out of key programs like Medicaid, Medicare. The treatment there is not the same. SSI, Supplemental Security Income, EITC, Earned Income Tax Credit, child tax credits. We're left out of key programs in the U.S. Chapter 9 is another example. The U.S. bankruptcy laws apply in Puerto Rico generally, across the board, except for Chapter 9. It used to apply for 45 years, but if my recollection serves me right, in the mid-'80s, there were some technical amendments made to the bankruptcy code, and without any reason that we can find in the record, congressional record, Puerto Rico was taken out of Chapter 9. And what is Chapter 9 in plain vanilla? It's simply a way in which government-owned entities like our power authority, our water and sewer authority, can reorganize themselves if they become insolvent under the protection of the bankruptcy court. They can adjust their debts to a reasonable level, not to liquidate themselves, but to reorganize themselves, to continue operating. So that's what my bill proposes. It says, allow us to have that mechanism. By the way, the state legislative assemblies are the ones deciding which entities are eligible, could be eligible to apply for Chapter 9 protection. So it's not automatic. And once you are eligible, you still have to comply with the bankruptcy code. You have to show that you're insolvent. That's not automatic. You need to show that you're not being able to pay your bills when they become due. And then you have to propose a plan. And a bankruptcy judge oversees it, oversees the process. You need to get, creditors need to be involved in the equation. You need to negotiate in good faith with the creditors, and if that doesn't work, that's when you can go to court. So, but people here, many times without much analysis, just simply, I could say playing politics, say, well, that's an easy way out. It's not an easy way out. Hey, it happens in America all the time. So many, corporate America I'm talking, it has happened all over. And in the case of government-owned entities, we should have a legal structure like Chapter 9 in case consensual negotiations with creditors do not work out. It's pretty sensible. It makes all the sense in the world. I can see now some creditors who are in the midst of a negotiation process saying, hey, this is not good for us. Because, it's like we're losing bargaining power here. Because if I am negotiating and I'm playing tough, and I can get, the answer could be, or the comeback could be, hey, if you keep pushing me, I'll have no choice but to go to bankruptcy court. Then that doesn't help their cause that much. But let's get real here. It doesn't help anybody for Puerto Rico to go down the drain, starting with the creditors. We all need to be reasonable. And in Congress, it doesn't make sense to simply say, let them survive this on their own.
Right. I mean, your legislation has got a lot of support among prominent Democrats. Nancy Pelosi, Elizabeth Warren on the Senate side, Leahy, Steny Hoyer, W. Wasserman Schultz But Republicans control the House and Senate, and they have shown no inclination to move either bill in either chamber. What's the solution? And the second part of that question is, how do you think the Obama administration has handled this? The Washington Post editorial page initially, on the initial Obama administration plan, criticized it as too low-key and then praised their more recent plan that's come out. Does the administration need to do more to exert more political influence? You came into office in 2009 with President Obama to really push this solution, or legislative, administrative combination. We're not hearing a lot from the White House on it.
Yes, well, the White House proposal is comprehensive, has 3 pillars. One of them deals with the debt itself. The other one proposes Medicaid funding, enhanced Medicaid funding. Let's be a bit specific here. We're so seriously underfunded that without giving us access to the exchanges that now we have in the States for acquiring a health plan, without access to that, if you treat Puerto Rico equally, you're talking about anywhere between minimum of $1.5 billion more yearly to Puerto Rico to up to $3 billion more, depending on the type of population you would be covering and so on. That's the technicalities. But so imagine, and the formula would change. Right now, the federal government pretty much picks up about half of the tab, 50% of the expense we have to take care of our medically indigent population. If we were treated as a state, the federal government would be picking up about 80% of the expense. So do the math. At a minimum, the government of Puerto Rico would be getting $1.2 billion more from the federal government, and it wouldn't be so that it's wasted. If, on the Republican side of the aisle, they tell me, I want to have oversight, I want to have strict oversight over that, I wouldn't oppose it. I wouldn't oppose it. Why? Because it is reasonable to say, okay, we're enhancing the funding. You've had some fiscal issues. Some of you were operating with deficits and financing deficits, and that's not a best practice in an accounting sense. So we want to have oversight. I would say, that's fine with me, but give me the additional funding. Another pillar of the White House proposal provides for including Puerto Rico in the EITC program. That's the most effective anti-poverty program, pro-labor participation program, another way of calling it, in the U.S. Some could say, well, but Puerto Rico, the American citizens in Puerto Rico do not pay taxes on their local income, federal income taxes. So why would they be included, or should they be included in this program? Well, the point is, the people who get the EITC benefits in the States do not pay federal taxes. They don't owe federal taxes, most of them anyway. It is intended to assist the needy across the nation. Puerto Rico is part of the nation. You need to go back and realize. And so EITC would be good because it would promote employment in Puerto Rico, because the way it works is you are in the formal economy. We do have an informal economy in Puerto Rico, probably larger than most places in the U.S. And so you promote people to go obtain a gainful employment, lawful employment, and then file their income tax and get a check from, in this case, could be the Treasury of Puerto Rico, but reimbursed by the federal government. So that's the second pillar. On the restructuring side, I see that the administration came out pretty much saying we should have Chapter 9 for all of the debt issued by government entities in Puerto Rico. I do not agree with that strategy. I don't think it is needed. I don't think we need a super Chapter 9. And if you want, I can be specific. I can tell you exactly why I think all we need is the regular Chapter 9. It's not panacea. It doesn't mean that with just Chapter 9 you solve all of our issues. We have to put our fiscal house in order. We have to promote growth in Puerto Rico. We need to get better funding in key federal programs, like I'm saying. But it is enough for purposes of handling our debt.
Well, as far we have a few minutes left, but how is this going to get done? When do you see? Is it part of the budget negotiations? Are you hopeful that maybe some type of bipartisan deal could be struck on this issue next month? When do you see anything actually being remedied?
This is a crisis, and I'm saying, I mean, what's the next piece of legislation we will be dealing with in Congress? An omnibus bill providing for the appropriations for our government to continue operating from December 12th on till the end of this fiscal year. That's an opportunity to at least handle some of these issues, not all, but we're talking about funding issues. So that's an opportunity, and we're working it, and we'll see if on the Republican side of the aisle it starts getting traction. Otherwise, it would have to be through regular order. And again, I say to my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle that I'm the first one who wants Puerto Rico to put its fiscal house in order. I'm the first one who says, if you want to do some oversight in exchange for additional funding or something like Chapter 9, I'm fine with it. But this is not so easy as saying, okay, let's impose a fiscal control board on Puerto Rico. Let's get real here now. That would be a blatant exercise of colonialism like I have never seen in recent history. I mean, Puerto Rico has a constitution. We elect our government officials. At least we have democracy at the local level. We do not have democracy at the national level because we do not have a congressional delegation and we don't vote for president. Now, are we saying that we're not going to even have democracy at the local level? That the federal government would simply be like a dictatorship over Puerto Rico and American citizens living there? That's offensive. So whoever proposes that is going to be facing me. It's going to be facing the whole, anybody who believes in democracy in the world. I mean, so again, we can do oversight. We can encourage, for example, GAO audits. I wouldn't mind having the GAO audit the government of Puerto Rico on a yearly basis and give specific recommendations as to ways in which we can improve our forecasting, budgeting, and accounting mechanisms, revenue and expense forecasting mechanisms. That's fine. You see, I will be reasonable, but you have to be reasonable in return.
It definitely seems like the next stop could be December 11th, the omnibus bill. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. Please thank the Congressman.
Thank you.
For talking about this issue. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. I want to introduce Teddy Downey. He is the executive editor and CEO of the Capital Forum. He's responsible for overseeing the firm's editorial coverage and growth, and he's going to be moderating the next two panel discussions. Please welcome Teddy Downey.
Thanks for the introduction, Bob. I think we should just get right into the next panel. It's a conversation on congressional action and what's at stake in the Puerto Rican fiscal crisis. I'd like to introduce John Bowker, partner at Arent Fox, Jeffrey Farrow, chairman at the Oliver Group, and Arturo Porzakansky, PhD professor and distinguished economist at American University. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And I think let's just jump right into the action. We heard a great conversation about the Treasury's proposal for Congress, and I'd like to go through and ask each of you what are the pros and cons of that proposal, and we've got a little on the outlook of what's going to happen with it in Congress, but would like some thoughts on that as well.
Sure. Well, I was a very young man 20 years ago when I actually worked on the last time the Congress looked at an issue like this, which was for the District of Columbia. And actually then, the Congress decided to put a federal control board in place. I understand that the congressman is reluctant to do that, and there were home rule issues when we dealt with the D.C. control board. And it was my former boss, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who stepped up as a pro-home rule advocate and said that this is the only way that the District of Columbia can get access to the bond markets, can deal with its accumulated fiscal deficit, can begin to allow the District of Columbia to thrive. I think the greatest issue with the Treasury proposal and some of the proposals we've seen, coming out of the congressmen and others, is that it's going to have a very difficult time passing, I think, in this Congress. I don't see Republican support for such a proposal. When we did the D.C. Control Board, there was bipartisan support for that proposal. But frankly, when we did it in '95, it then had to be coupled with the Revitalization Act for the District of Columbia in 1997, which dealt with the Medicaid issue, gave the district a greater share of Medicaid, dealt with the pension issue. The federal government assumed the district's unfunded pension liability, which had been built up prior to home rule by the Congress. And there were tax incentives, the first-time homebuyer credit, a wage credit, zero capital gains taxes on certain business transactions. So those two things had to be put together in order for the district to get access to the markets and to put it in a position where it could thrive. And since then, of course, the district has seen balanced budgets and surpluses, and all you have to do is go around the city and look at all the cranes, to see the amazing growth that the District of Columbia has seen. So the Congress has done this once before. There is a blueprint for this. It was supported on a bipartisan basis in a way that I think these other proposals would have difficulty seeing bipartisan support.
Jeffrey?
Well, I think you've really heard from Congressman Pierluisi and now what the prospects are for the Treasury Department proposal. Let's just take the elements of it. One is that Puerto Rico be authorized, as a state is authorized, to enable its municipalities to insolvent municipalities to restructure their debt. But also the administration proposes going beyond that and allowing Puerto Rico itself to restructure the government of Puerto Rico debt as a whole, which is unprecedented. States don't have that authority. I'm not going to say whether it's a good or bad idea to do this because I don't think that's what your question is. The question is, how viable are these proposals?
Also the pros and cons. Not just viability, but the workability.
Well, I think the first pro and con is this possible? And we don't see any indication. There's not one Republican who has supported Chapter 9 authority for Puerto Rico so far. So to expect that the Congress is going to allow Puerto Rico to restructure all of its debt, even if I might want to say that's a good idea. And of course, everybody would not like to not have to pay the debts that they've incurred. If you ask Congressman Pierluisi, as you have, or you ask any of the leading candidates for governor in Puerto Rico right now, they would say we don't need to restructure all of our debts. There's a lot that needs to be done at the local government level, and we can get into some detail about that. So you don't have it's not that Puerto Rico is asking for restructuring all of its debt. There's even a debate about Chapter 9 authority within Puerto Rico itself that's fairly substantial. But you do have the principal elected officials now in Puerto Rico supporting Chapter 9. As I said, you don't have a single Republican, so you question the viability of going beyond that. Puerto Rico, Congressman Pierluisi explained that a lot of Puerto Rico has a debt crisis right now. But it doesn't have an economic crisis. I see a lot about an economic crisis. And a crisis is something that's an immediate happening. Puerto Rico has a long-term economic challenge. As Congressman Pierluisi said, Puerto Rico's economy has been shrinking for 9.5 years. In that 9.5 years, it's lost 20% of its jobs. The economy as a whole is contracted by 20%. The territory has lost 8% of its population. And that trend seems to be continuing, at least for the foreseeable future. And you can't raise as much revenue. Puerto Rico does some tax increases. There's a lot that Puerto Rico ought to be doing on its own on the tax side. There's a lot of money that's not being taxed, either because it's being evaded or because the government of Puerto Rico itself is allowing people has policies, most of which are misguided, to allow people and companies to not pay taxes on the theory that this is going to generate a lot of investment. But on a cost-benefit basis, you wouldn't agree that the taxes that are being foregone are worth it. Earned income tax credit and the administration also proposed equality for Puerto Rico on the child tax credit, and I think this is a great example of the irrationality of federal laws as they apply to Puerto Rico. Low-income workers in Puerto Rico can get the child tax credit if they have 3 or more children. They can't get it if they have 1 child or 2 children. So you're, young working family, you've got 2 kids. We can, let's have another baby, and we'll be able to get $3,000 a year from the federal government, as opposed to we have 2 kids and we get 0. It's an irrational policy. I was involved with the creation of that policy. There were specific reasons why it was viable legislatively to do the 3 or more kids when I was in the Clinton White House. But it, like much of policy with respect to Puerto Rico, there's no real rhyme or reason why you have all of the labor and environmental laws apply, which I agree with, and other costs of doing business. But Puerto Rico is losing about $9 billion a year in not being treated equally in federal programs. That's a fundamental problem with it. I think those proposals from the administration, while I think there's Republicans may not be anxious to go along with that, my sense is those proposals are more viable than the idea of bankruptcy for all of the government of Puerto Rico, when there are things that the government of Puerto Rico can't do when people are complaining about whether they have good numbers from Puerto Rico. The final element is what the administration proposed in terms of a financial oversight mechanism. And as Congressman Pierluisi said, you will get leaders in Puerto Rico who will agree that there can be enhanced financial oversight of Puerto Rico by the federal government. But we shouldn't even be talking about control board as a serious issue. And the DC is different than Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico, first of all, let me just be very precise. Puerto Rico is not part of the United States. Puerto Rico is a possession of the United States. And that means several things. As a territory, it doesn't have voting representation in the federal government, but also as an unincorporated territory, not part of the United States. Congress does not need to treat Puerto Rico equally with the states. The DC is part of the United States constitutionally. Puerto Rico is not. And so, and that's why we have these great disparities on issues like Medicaid, supplemental security income, which Puerto Rico gets virtually no money under. We get about $1.9 billion a year for the needy, age-blind, and disabled, people who under no circumstance could support themselves. But Puerto Rico, the fundamental issue of Puerto Rico that creates the economic problems is the question of what's Puerto Rico's ultimate political status. Is Puerto Rico going to become a state, or is it going to become a nation? And that's very fundamental, because as you think about any sort of law, if Puerto Rico's ultimate destiny is to become a state, then we ought to be integrating Puerto Rico equally into the laws, and because ultimately that's what will occur if Puerto Rico is going to be a state. If Puerto Rico is going to be a nation, then you ought to treat Puerto Rico uniquely. And there's a lot of support for both options in Puerto Rico, and about 20-25% of the people of Puerto Rico support the kind of in-between status quo. But one thing all of the political movements in Puerto Rico agree upon is opposition to the federal government retaking control of the government of Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans were allowed to elect their own governor, and they did for the first time in 1948. The law was passed in 47. There will be massive resistance to the idea of controlling Puerto Rico's finances. So therefore, that's also, to the extent people are interpreting the administration's suggestion, and this is not what the administration implied, but the way some folks are running with it on the Hill, that there should be a financial control board. That's not realistic. You will not get enough Democrats to support that to be able to enact a bill, even if all the Republicans do. And Republicans, let me just finish. Republicans don't control the Senate. They do control the House, but they have a majority in the Senate. So I think we're talking about, on this administration proposal, some aspects that are good, some aspects that might be bad in a lot of ways. In an ivory tower way, you could say a lot of this is fine. What really matters is what can pass the U.S. Congress. And in order for that to happen, I think the administration is going to have to, would have to engage a little more than it has so far, than just testifying at a hearing and throwing out ideas and not having specific legislative package.
I want to get back to that and the treasuries and how involved the White House has been or not involved. But Arturo, can we get your thoughts here?
So I would say that the good thing is that finally the Obama administration has shown that it cares a little bit about Puerto Rico, enough to stake out a position and so on. Because over the past 2 years, my sources tell me that basically whenever the Puerto Rican authorities would go to Treasury would tell them, clean up your act, we need this we need a hole in our head, and deal with the next administration. I'm sure Hillary will treat you well. And so it's nice that finally they're showing some cards. The other good thing about it is that it's true. If and when Puerto Rico's fiscal problems are addressed, the federal government will have to play a part, like it did in the case of the District of Columbia. Puerto Rico is a very poor island, poorer than any state in the United States. It's estimated that 7 out of 10 Puerto Ricans in the island get their medical care through Medicaid. So it is a very poor island, and they need federal help. The things that I don't like is everything else. Obviously, Congress needs to get involved too. It's a territory. Congress is supposed to set the rules. And 100 years ago, Congress set the rule which Puerto Rico, and only Puerto Rico, could sell bonds in all 50 states of the United States. That's why Puerto Rico racked up a debt of over $70 billion, surpassed only by California and New York, that I need not tell you how populated and wealthy those states are. It was like giving Puerto Rico a credit card to a teenager with no limit, and they've used it again and again and again and again. So Congress, the last thing it should do is say, oh, all that credit card debt you racked up thanks to the credit card I gave you, forget about it. That's all right. Well, wave a magic wand, then you don't have to pay it. No, Congress has to be involved in the solution as well. It's not just the federal government, but it has to be involved in a constructive way, in a way that will enable Puerto Rico to come back to the bond market. Because once you racked up a debt of that size, even if you refinance it, even if you get debt relief, etc., you need to come back to the bond market. That should be the objective. And the last thing you want to do in order to come back to any financial market is default on all your debt. Nobody does that. Everybody follows a seniority rule so that, for instance, the GOs, which are constitutionally protected, you pay those so that you can issue more GOs in the future. Otherwise, if you default on everything, you'll never come back to the bond markets, and then Puerto Rico will become, more than ever before, a ward of the federal government.
So we've got a very good sense that Congress is probably not going to do very much, at least right now. And Jeffrey, you mentioned that there's not really an economic crisis, more of a slow economic bleed, really, in Puerto Rico. And there is a debt crisis, though. What are some of the things what facts on the ground, how do things have to get worse to make this a more visceral issue for people in Congress, and to spur some action and maybe even some more activity at the White House? And we can.
Well, I mean, I can just, again, give the example of the District of Columbia. The district had racked up, an accumulated deficit. It was beginning to be in a position where it was going to default on its metro payment, default on its vendor payments, not be able to pay its payroll. At one point, the district had what we called at the time the fifth quarter, where it put off its obligations into this mysterious fifth quarter. Once those things started happening, it was clear that that the Congress needed to step up. And I want to get back to for a moment to the question of leadership, whether it's presidential leadership or leadership from the congressmen and others, because when the District of Columbia faced insolvency, the congresswoman was a Democrat, still is. Eleanor Holmes Norton still represents the District of Columbia. The president was a Democrat, President Bill Clinton, and they both stood up and said, we will allow some of this control in order to get out of this mess and let the district thrive. And the most heavily negotiated provisions of the Control Board bill in '95 were what we called the home rule provisions, where the District of Columbia's budget had to be approved by the Control Board, but there was a back and forth mechanism built into that bill where the council would propose and the Control Board would go back and negotiate with the council. If the council passed legislation that was incompatible with the 5-year balanced budget plan that was put forward, there was back and forth and safeguards built in, so the Control Board just couldn't wipe out home rule with the stroke of a pen. There were provisions in there that would allow the local voices to be heard and to be respected. And that was why it was so important, I think, for someone like Congresswoman Norton to stand up and say, it was almost like Nixon going to China, Only the Congresswoman, who was as passionate about the rights of her city as you heard the Congressman earlier this morning, could stand up and say, okay, I will accept this, but on these conditions. And she had to go all over this city and sell that to every corner of the District of Columbia, and had the President of the United States backing her up. And it was that leadership, I think, which made the difference. And I understand the differences between Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia, but I just give this as one example as how it worked in an equally inflammatory political environment.
Where the Republicans were also in charge in Congress.
That's
So
right.
It's not that Democrats and Republicans could not rally
That's right.
around a just cause. They
Exactly.
did.
Yeah. I think the issue, though, is very different in Puerto Rico. The governor of Puerto Rico, the current governor, is head of a political movement, the theory of which is that the federal government does not have the power to impose a control board on Puerto Rico. And so if the federal government were to do that, the whole theory of his political movement, the party that he heads, that's one of the two largest parties in Puerto Rico, that party is divided, but his faction of that party, which includes the President of the Senate, the Speaker of the House, their politics are based on the theory that Puerto Rico's political status gives it immunity from federal government control on local government matters. You have an independence party. The other part of the governor's party is for a nationhood status as well. And then you have a statehood party, and all of these. In D.C., you had an Eleanor Holmes Norton who would go around the district and say, this is the compromise we have to make. In Puerto Rico, the leaders are saying, we're not willing to make that compromise. And but I want to get back to your question, is what has to happen for things to happen up here? And one is, in reality, things probably have to get worse in Puerto Rico. Number two, Puerto Rico needs to do some things on its own. I heard when the Treasury unveiled its plan, there was discussion about the government of Puerto Rico's plan, fiscal adjustment plan. There's no government of Puerto Rico fiscal adjustment plan. There's an idea of a plan that the governor proposed that he hasn't yet submitted to the Legislative Assembly of Puerto Rico because it's pretty clear it wouldn't pass the Legislative Assembly of Puerto Rico. He submitted one element of this, and I think it's very useful to look at. One element of this has been submitted to the legislature of Puerto Rico, which is to create a control board at the local government level, which is constitutionally impossible, and which today the Legislative Assembly will presumably act with finality on that proposal, and it will not be a fiscal control board. It'll be a fiscal oversight board, a monitoring board, and I think that's very that's very useful. But it won't be a control board because we are a system of law. We have a system of laws in our country, and the basic laws are the Constitution. The Constitution of Puerto Rico, just like the Constitution of the United States, provides for the election periodically of a new legislative assembly. And this legislative assembly cannot and is not going to bind the next legislative assembly. So I think some of these things are going to need to play out, and I think I'm not critical of many of the Republicans who've said this is a more complicated issue than just doing Chapter 9 or bankruptcy authority, or to use Senator Grassley's words, I don't agree with his words, but is it just federal programs? No. This is you require structural change, fundamental structural change in Puerto Rico and in the federal government with respect to Puerto Rico. The federal government Dr. Persansky is right. Puerto Rico issued too much debt. It issued debt for government operations. This really started in earnest about 2001 as the economy started the decline, really precipitously. It went down in 2006. But Puerto Rico is responsible for that. It's responsible for a lot of waste and mismanagement. And you can pick up the newspaper in Puerto Rico any day and see new proposals for spending that probably oughtn't exist, or new tax exemption proposals that probably oughtn't happen. But the federal government is equally responsible for Puerto Rico's situation by the incoherent application of federal law to Puerto Rico that I mentioned earlier, saying you have all the regulations, but you don't get $9 billion worth of federal funding, even for people who would not be able to pay taxes themselves. And we're going to allow you, and we're going to create a situation where you have a lot of businesses avoiding taxation under both federal and territorial law. And so that in 2011, according to Senators Levin and McCain, the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, Microsoft made $4.5 billion worth of profits in Puerto Rico. It saved $1.5 billion that year by being operating in Puerto Rico. It attributed 47% of its sales throughout the United States to its Puerto Rico subsidiary. It had 179 employees in Puerto Rico, and it paid the government of Puerto Rico $41 million. So that's an effective tax rate of about 1%. And that wasn't, the senators looked at 3 years running, and that was the average. That's 1 out of 35 companies in Puerto Rico. And there are other tax schemes as well. The sales tax revenue in Puerto Rico, 44% of the sales tax revenue doesn't go into the government's coffers. If it's either not charged by the merchant, or the merchant is not passing what they collect on to the government. So there's a very different reality in Puerto Rico than what's being discussed up here.
And Doctor?
Yeah, so I described where the original sin was committed 100 years ago, but definitely the current day biggest sinner is the governor. I think he wants to have his cake and eat it too. Under local law and the local constitution, he's supposed to pay his debts. So he wants the federal government via Congress to override the constitution and the local law and mandate him or give him a free pass not to comply with the bond indentures and the debt. At the same time, hey, don't mess with my independence. It's okay to tell me not to obey the Constitution and the laws when it comes to paying the debts, but I want you not to, tell me what to do when it comes to spending, inefficiency, waste, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that is such a duplicitous attitude. It may make a lot of sense politically if he wants to salvage his role in history, but I mean, his popularity is so low, it's going to go down in history badly. Anyway, the least he could do is use his last year to do the courageous thing and say, you know what, I'm not going to be duplicitous. If I want you to come in and give me Chapter 9 or whatever relief, and also federal money, so much federal money that maybe I don't even have to balance the budget, I'm willing to do something on the spending side and give me a board that will let me do the things that I cannot do because of the promises I made on election time or the stand of the party and so on. So I think we need greater reality and realism in San Juan before we will see it in Washington. And that's how it should be.
I agree, but I think folks up here who want to address the problem have to recognize the political reality in Puerto Rico of what people are going to do, as well as the political reality of the Congress, that there's just a lot of ivory tower thinking in terms of addressing this problem, and people trying to deal with the symptoms rather than the root causes of the problem.
Well, I want to thank all three of you for joining us today, and I would just like to end with I think it was interesting that you pointed out that this is a complex problem, but for everyone here involved in the congressional debate here, there did seem to be three distinct areas that you pointed out that need to be addressed. One is the structural reforms in Puerto Rico in terms of how they govern themselves and deal with their fiscal issues. The other is, what is the federal government's role in helping Puerto Rico deal with its debt burden? And then lastly, the federal spending issues. So these are three concrete areas that there is a lot of conversation. There are a lot of proposals, and I think we've left the audience a lot to chew on as they help their bosses make decisions. So thanks so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Do we just go? Okay, great. Well, that was a great conversation. I'd like to invite up our next panelists. We've got Mark Calabria, PhD, Director of Financial Regulation Studies at the Cato Institute. Good to see you too. Eric Lecomte, Executive Director of Jubilee USA. We've got the Honorable Judge Stephen Rhodes, retired U.S. Bankruptcy Court, Eastern District of Michigan.
It's an honor to meet you.
And Eric Schnurr, founder and president of Public Works. Thanks for coming.
Nice to meet you, Eric.
So I'll just kick things right off. We heard a lot about Congress's role in all of this, and I think there was a pretty clear consensus that we might very well get nothing or very little out of Congress on this issue, at least until things get materially worse. And this panel is really about what are the executive options and the options of other stakeholders in this debate and in this crisis. And I think I'd like to start with a question of, what are the options for the executive branch, and what are the pros and cons from a legal and political perspective of those different options? To start perfectly with Mark here.
Well, I'm going to talk about three, buckets and their potentiality, and two of those buckets are at the Federal Reserve. And so I'm going to use numbers like 14.2, and for those non-lawyers in the room, what I'm talking about is Section 14, Paragraph 2 of the Federal Reserve Act. And I'm going to talk about 13.3, and then something at Treasury known as the Exchange Stabilization Fund. And the way to think about these buckets is what areas they cover. So 14 covers open market operations, and the way to think about this in terms of Puerto Rico is this is the provisions of the Federal Reserve Act that allow the Federal Reserve to buy varieties of state and municipal debt. They're not allowed to buy private debt. They're not allowed to buy public corporation debt under Section 14. Section 13, however, is kind of the private, and this is the one that we learned about repeatedly in the crisis for the rescues of AIG and Bear and other entities. And of course, 13, you can't do municipal, but you can do public corporation. And of course, I think we should keep in mind that much of the problem in Puerto Rico has to do with the public corporations in addition to the municipal debt. And then lastly, the Exchange Stabilization Fund at Treasury, which of course during the crisis was used to rescue the mutual fund industry and was also used in the 90s during the peso crisis in Mexico. And so let me start with, I think, is the easiest to take off the table, which is 14. And I'm going to apologize to have buckets within buckets. It's going to be like one of those little Russian dolls after a while. But so within 14, there are three types. And again, the way to think about this is Section 14 of the Federal Reserve Act is not an assistance program. It's not designed, it's not structured, it's not intended to be an assistance program. What it's intended to do is govern the investments that the Federal Reserve itself can make. And that's the intent of it, that's the structure. And essentially it says that the Federal Reserve can make three types of investments. The most easiest and the easiest to disregard really quickly is the Federal Reserve can invest in treasuries and agencies. And by agencies, I mean Fannie, Freddie, Ginnie Mae, these sorts of things. Obviously, Puerto Rico does not fall in that camp. Interestingly enough, the Federal Reserve Act allows the Fed to buy foreign government debt. And there has been some argument suggested that Puerto Rico might qualify. In my opinion, I think the legal basis for that is quite thin. And I'm happy to talk about that if people really want to go that. But the real debate is the municipal side of this. And the really interesting part of this is what the Federal Reserve Act says is that the Federal Reserve can invest in maturities less than 6 months of municipalities, state government, in the continental United States. And of course, the Act actually defines the continental United States to just simply mean the states in the District of Columbia. So there's some debate over whether would Puerto Rico qualify under Section 14. And the arguments I've heard mostly from Professor Arturo Estrella, I think are just wrong, to be generous. They're based on, I think, a misread of the law. And so to me, I don't think 14 is the way to go, but let's set aside, and again, if people want to argue about why they're part of the continental United States or not, that's fine. I just don't think, I put it this way, first-year law student would not make these kind of arguments. But that aside, let's say they do kind of apply, because one of the things to keep in mind, as we learned in the AIG litigation, is that the Federal Reserve can do things that are illegal and not suffer any penalty, which of course is what the judge ruled. Basically, you broke the law, but nothing's going to happen. And so, because I've occasionally heard the characterization of the Federal Reserve being a lack of political will, and there is a sense of, and again, the AIG is not the only thing. I could probably think of 4 or 5 other things that government officials did illegally in the financial crisis and no one's going to pay any penalty for. Because, of course, as a generality, we don't hold federal officials responsible for illegal behavior. So that said, the Fed could do things and say, let's put the law aside, we want to do this. I will note that in July, before House Financial Services, Janet Yellen said she did not have the authority. So her opinion is they do not have the legal authority. Another way to think about the Fed before I talk about 13.3 is the Fed assistance really is about liquidity. It's about you've hit a patch in the road. It's not about structural reform. And we've heard that repeatedly, that the last panel, structural reform, the fact that the governor came out in June and said the debts are unpayable, that really undermines the Fed's legal case. So, of course, for the Fed to do this, they would have to put a legal case together. And one of the qualifications of Section 14, assuming you apply, is that the Federal Reserve and the assistee have to show that the debts are payable. There's a qualification requirement of the debt has to be assured, the revenue has to be forthcoming. So it essentially, the way to think about Section 14 is it's structured in a way to essentially eliminate credit risk from Federal Reserve investments. And you have to be able to overcome that objection to say there's no credit risk here. But that said, I think you could get through those hoops. The 6-month maturity is certainly an issue, but you could do swaps. You could swap out the short-term debt for long-term debt. I would worry that that would actually accelerate the crisis, because then you'd have debt coming up every 6 months, which only would, to me, rile the markets even more. Than if you actually would want to go the other direction, which is to extend the maturities rather than reduce the maturities. But that said, there is a long, convoluted path to potentially using Section 14 of the Federal Reserve Act that, to me, raises very serious legal problems, but even the legal problems can be overcome. It's hard to see it be workable, but it's possible. Let's go to 13 really quick. And 13, of course, was, again, what I said was used for AIG. I'll also say, as an aside, Section 14 was what was used to buy Fannie and Freddie debt by the Federal Reserve. And, of course, at the time of those purchases, Freddie and Fannie were insolvent. But Fannie and Freddie are treated a whole different standard in the Federal Reserve Act. And again, it's a separate subtitle. But back to 13, one of the arguments I quickly want to dismiss that I've heard is that the Dodd-Frank changes to 13.3 don't impact because they haven't been promulgated by regulation yet. That's false. Certainly under a lot of statutes, these statutes does not become effective until regulations have been promulgated. Dodd-Frank's Title 11 takes effect when the law was passed. And why does that matter here? So for instance, one of the restrictions is that if you are in a bankruptcy proceeding, so if someone decides if we do the Chapter 9 route, that gets passed, Puerto Rico enters Chapter 9, by law, you can't use 13.3 assistance. You're barred by law for anybody in the proceedings to use 13.3. But also there's requirements, so there's a number of requirements. And again, let me emphasize, 13.3 is a potential route for the public corporations, not for the government itself. So you could potentially take the power company to 13.3. You could provide some sort of assistance. And of course, there are requirements that it's got to be collateralized, that the Federal Reserve's got to be senior, that they essentially have to be first in line. So to me, there's a potentiality of 13.3 assistance. It's not clear to me. You're certainly not fixing the structural issues. And of course, you have to set up a whole assistance program. So one of the requirements of Dodd-Frank is that 13.3 has to be broadly available. It can't just be for one-off bailouts. So 13.3, the requirements under Dodd-Frank were really targeted at, no more AIGs, no more bears. And these, they're not as, I'll be the first to say, not as tight as I would like. But they do have restrictions on this. But I do think that if you did the power company, you did the development bank, you could probably structure this in a way where a court's not going to laugh it out and say that, okay, this is broadly eligible, you have a number of participants. But it is important to keep in mind you can't just structure this for one participant under 13.3. But again, to me, the burdens there are going to be, how do you prove the solvency? Because 13.3 is very clear that you're not supposed to provide assistance to insolvent institutions. But again, that may well be possible with the power company. But again, these are some barriers that I think can be met. And certainly the Federal Reserve has some flexibility here. But let me, before I turn to the Treasury, again reiterate, Janet Yellen, chair of the Fed, has said, we don't have these authorities. We're going to monitor the situation, but we basically shouldn't be involved. I'll certainly say on the other side, in the July hearing, she wasn't very specific. So she didn't go through and said, this is what 14 says, this is what 13 said. She just said, we can't be involved. So, of course, I think she's got enough room that if she was to change path, she could probably come up with a legal justification for some actions if she wanted to. I do think that, and it's worth keeping in mind that I believe there's a Federal Reform Act that's scheduled maybe this week or next week to come to the floor. The Federal Reserve's under a lot of political pressure. And I think for the Federal Reserve's first instincts are going to be unsurprisingly self-preservation. And so I don't think that the Federal Reserve politically is looking to get into a battle at a time itself is under attack. But that said, it's a potential route. And again, 13 would be the route rather than 14. And it would really be a route where they would be targeted at the public corporations, not the municipality itself. Treasury has much more flexibility with its Exchange Stabilization Fund. Say as an aside, this was created as part of the Gold Act of 1934, established to manage the gold dollar parity. You probably noticed we don't actually do that anymore. So this is a provision of law, $50 billion more or less at Treasury that they can kind of use as a slush fund. There were restrictions put on it in Dodd-Frank, but those restrictions would not apply to the situation with Puerto Rico. So you could certainly see something very similar to what we did in the Mexico peso crisis in the 90s, where some assistance was provided via the Exchange Stabilization Fund. Obviously, that requires a commitment from the Treasury and at least implicitly, if not explicitly, some backing from the president. So there's certainly a little bit more political risk there. But again, to me, those are the options that, to me, that's the most flexible. It's also arguably the most democratically accountable. The president actually is elected, where Janet Yellen is not. And so I do think that there's a willingness maybe on the part of the president to take a little bit more risk. So I would say if you're looking for options, the Exchange Stabilization Fund is really probably the direction to go. But again, Treasury is going to be very concerned about making any sort of investment under it in which they actually lose money. So the way to think about these things are they're generally structured to provide liquidity. It's a bridge from one problem to the next. And they're really not going to be, and I'll end with saying, even all of the assistance, we think about AIG assistance under 13.3, AIG was massively restructured by the Federal Reserve, as it should have been. So it's important to keep in mind, even with Fannie and Freddie, I mentioned the assistance under Section 14 of the Federal Reserve Act, Fannie and Freddie got assistance, the equity assistance came from elsewhere. As did the restructuring. So almost all of these things that the Fed did during the crisis, with the exception of Bear, there were restructurings, and obviously Bear went away. So these tools were never, in my opinion, sufficient on their own. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. So apologize, I know there's a lot
No,
of
that's a fantastic way to
weeds
kick
detail.
off the panel. Eric, maybe.
Yeah, let me offer a few comments. And I mean, Mark really did an incredible job in terms of outlining the buckets. And, you know, we come from the same approach in terms of seeing those same buckets there. You know, we do believe that in this particular situation, that, you know, the Fed could probably do more in terms of offering a legal justification. I think specifically what the Fed is concerned about right now, as Mark alluded to, is the need to amend Dodd-Frank or 1504. And I think that's, you know, when we're talking about what's happening in the Fed offices, that's the conversation that's being kicked around right now. In terms of, you know, all of those being administrative or executive ways to solve the crisis, you know, I'd like to just take a moment to talk a little bit about, you know, on the ground, how the crisis is being perceived, and also talk about some of the other options that are out there, given, I think, what is broad agreement that Congress, if it does act, is not going to act quick enough. And I think we're slow to see some of these administrative and executive actions. So I think the reality of it is if we call this a debt crisis, a limited debt crisis, if we call this an economic crisis, a financial crisis, a prolonged recession, I think the word that is most descriptive of what's happening, and the word that many people would use on the ground in Puerto Rico, is that what we're facing is a humanitarian crisis. And we need to bring that home because we have to understand that already, over the last 2 years, the island's government has had self-imposed austerity plans in place, where over 100 schools have been closed. We've seen very specific and important emergency health care abilities closed and ceased by the government of Puerto Rico. And right now, if we're looking at what's happening in the front pages, you know, we're talking about a very serious health care crisis in general that's taking place on the island. In Puerto Rico right now, nearly 1 out of 2 people live in poverty. And this isn't, you know, the kind of poverty as bad as it is as we see here in DC. This is people, American citizens, that are living in shacks with tin roofs. I mean, this is what we're talking about here. And so that's what we have to bring home, because when we're talking about whether it's Congress acts or whether it's the administration or Treasury or the Federal Reserves to act, I mean, the reality is we have an urgent situation that we have to find a way to resolve, because we're dealing with 3.5 million American citizens facing a humanitarian crisis. You know, we believe also that, you know, the government of Puerto Rico is at fault for a lot of what's happened. There's no doubt about that. And there are also challenges to Puerto Rico that are unique to its status. But the reality of it is, just as in Washington, D.C. and the, you know, New York City, Detroit, other types of places, we have to take some responsibility for American citizens here. These aren't citizens in Grenada. These aren't citizens in El Salvador. These are our people. So, you know, we come from that very specific point of view of a humanitarian crisis because Jubilee USA, my organization that was founded by a range of religious groups from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops to American Jewish World Service, the Big Ten religious Protestant denominations in the United States, we look at this in terms of how economic policies impact poor and vulnerable people. And because of that, we work directly with the religious leaders on the island, Archbishop Roberto Nieves Gonzalez and the other Episcopal, Anglican, Lutheran, Methodist, United Church of Christ, Congregational, Pentecostal leaders on the island, evangelical, that to the point in Puerto Rico, we're working with the religious leaders that are speaking on behalf of more than 99% of Puerto Rico's population. And they are looking at this in terms of seeing people lose more jobs, seeing more of their people flee to the United States. The hardest thing to buy in Puerto Rico right now is a suitcase because so many people are leaving the island. And so, you know, I think the reality is we're talking about a humanitarian crisis that we have to solve because it's American citizens, our people, that are being hurt by this crisis. So I think just keeping that in mind and kind of what our stake in this is as Jubilee USA, you know, a group that I think because of the religious voice is why, you know, we're cited by Congressional Quarterly to be the last standing bipartisan coalition in Washington. You know, I guess it's worth something at this point. our sense has been is that we have to find a way to resolve it. So I think the first panel this morning talking about the congressional options was very fine. I think there were some other details there that we could have also gone into that could have shown how we can shore up what's happening on the fiscal side in Puerto Rico, which I think are promising and innovative. Certainly, with how dire the situation is, we would love to see one of the administrative or executive actions that Mark described move forward. But knowing that's all slow to come, I think we have to acknowledge the reality that right now, as we're meeting here, on and off, small groups of creditors are meeting, small groups of creditors are meeting with the government of Puerto Rico. And I think what we're looking either in the short term or the long term at is a reality that either the government is going to continue to try to solve this piecemeal with groups of creditors, which is going to go on possibly for years, or there's going to be some kind of ability, hopefully, for a more comprehensive creditor committee to be created to negotiate directly with the government, so we might see some solutions put on the table in the short term. I think some of this is as simple as a math equation in terms of getting the country back to debt sustainability, back to the point of which it can again pay its debts. And that's going to require some degree of haircut from all the actors. It also should also include ways to strengthen accountability and transparency in the finances of the government of Puerto Rico as well. But either short-term or long-term, what we're left with is either a prolonged way of trying to resolve this, and best case that it's more short-term directly between the government and its creditors. But generally, when these situations are resolved these ways, it makes a humanitarian crisis, it makes a financial crisis even worse because of how long it takes to resolve it.
And I'd like to come back to Judge Rhodes in a second with a couple of specific questions for him. So, Eric, do you want to jump in this conversation?
I was just thinking it's difficult to go last after all of these great speakers that we've had. Although Friday I was on a panel on a different subject in Mexico City, and I discovered that the worst situation is to be the last speaker before lunch. So this is a little bit of an improvement. So I was listening to all of this. I was thinking there's two quotes that are somewhat relevant to this situation. One is one I always liked from Winston Churchill, who said that you can always count on the United States of America to do the right thing after it's tried all the other alternatives. And I think that's likely to be the case here. The other is this line from Tolstoy about all happy families are the same, but all unhappy families are different in their unhappiness. And I think that would be applicable to Puerto Rico as well. It's a somewhat unique place, and I think you have to understand the actors and the complexities down there to get the full richness of what the problem is and what the possible solutions are. But I'd say a couple things about what we have to do to resolve this situation and to resolve it over time, which is the only way we're going to resolve it, which is my first point. This has been a long time coming, and it's going to be a long time going. There's not a short-term solution, and there is not going to be a short-term solution, as I think pretty much everybody has agreed. We're not going to see anything within the immediate future, nor do I think you could. The problem with Puerto Rico living beyond its means as a government has been going on for at least 40 years, probably longer. And if you look at the magnitude of its debt and what its economic base is and various other things, I mean, it's really a 40-year solution. It's not something that's going to be solved in a year. There's a long-term workout to this. It's the only way you're going to get there, and that's how I think the problem has to be approached. Secondly, secondly, I think we have to understand that this isn't just a financial issue or a financial problem. It's also a fiscal problem. It's a governmental problem. It's a political problem. And there's one other problem I wanted to cite, but I'm missing one. But anyway, the problem's it's ultimately an economic problem. Thirdly, because of all that, I don't think that there's a quote-unquote legal solution that's going to emerge here. It's going to be an extra-legal solution. We need something like out of a movie where the sheriff, instead of enforcing the law, brings everybody together on more or less false pretenses, locks the room, and refuses to let them out until they've banged heads sufficiently that everybody is a little bit bloodied and they've all come to an agreement to cooperate. There's a lot of people, everybody involved in this, every actor is going to have to take a hit of some sort. Which brings me to the final point about all this, which is that there's a number of malefactors, might be too strong a term, but there's a lot of actors who shoulder blame for this, and all of them are going to have to get involved in making some kind of recompense for that. And in a lot of ways, this is a microcosm of all the larger issues we've seen talked about in this country and in the world at large in the last couple of years about what do you do about creditors and debtors, what do you do about our entire financial system, what do you do about economic development, what do you do about government spending. And everybody is going to have to address this in different ways. To simplify a complex situation, I'd say that you essentially have three main actors who have to get locked in that room together and come to some kind of resolution. And it's the equivalent of the junkie, the drug dealer, and the cop who roughs up the junkie and subsidizes the drug dealer. And those are respectively the Puerto Rican government, the financial community, and the federal government. It's not like anybody who's been buying Puerto Rican bonds in the last couple of years has been unaware of what the financial and budgetary situation is in Puerto Rico. And to be shocked that there was gambling at the casino at this point is a little bit disingenuous. I think that the bondholder community has to recognize some responsibility for having continued to supply the drug of choice to the junkie. And I don't think the answer is a haircut, but I do think the answer is to recognize, as I said at the beginning, that this is a 40-year solution, and there needs to be some kind of restructuring based on the other actors taking some responsibility as well that leads to the ultimate solution. And that brings you to what do the other actors do. The federal government is likely to stand by and say this isn't our problem for a while still. But it is our problem, not just because these are American citizens and because ultimately it's a part of the United States and we'll have to deal politically and economically with any kinds of default that happens there. But the federal government is culpable in its way for part of the problems down there. I absolutely agree with the Puerto Rican government that the Jones Act should be repealed. That imposes shipping costs on Puerto Rico that drive up its costs, drive down its economy. It simply isn't fair, it isn't right, and you're compounding a problem for a place that has a problem already. They have an island economy down there. Obviously, it's an island. One of the implications of that is that they essentially have no sources of energy. The energy has to be imported, driving up the cost of imports so that it has to be even more expensive to have any form of energy is simply not a wise policy for the United States to be imposing on Puerto Rico and then saying, gee, what are we going to do? We have a bad economy down there. It's partially caused by federal policies, and those should be changed. What's been mentioned a lot is the cap on Medicaid spending. The federal government does not treat Puerto Rico the same as states for overall Medicaid spending. Given the poverty levels on the island, the figures I've actually seen are 60% of the island is at or below the poverty level. You have a large percentage of the population that needs Medicaid assistance. To be capping that costs the Puerto Rican government literally hundreds of millions of dollars a year on a total budget that's $10 billion, at least the operating budget's $10 billion, several $100 million a year in expenses that that if they were a state they wouldn't be having, is not a burden, obviously, that the government can be bearing. That said, the Puerto Rican government deserves a lot of the credit for the situation that it's in today. The flip side of the Medicaid situation is that about a decade or so ago, they decided to create a health care program that was like Obamacare before Obama came along. And it's a very nice, generous program. It's utterly unrealistic in the current environment. It provides more or less free health care to virtually everybody. It's not means tested. So all of us would be getting taxpayer subsidized health care, which means it's not taxpayer subsidized. The money's coming from nowhere, basically, and we're all getting free health care. Well, that's not a realistic position, and the government of Puerto Rico needs to address that. There are many other things that they can be doing to arrest that situation as well. There's a lot of talk about what are we going to do? We can't cut our way out of this because we're a poor nation. They refer to themselves as a nation down there very frequently. And that's largely true. You're going to give the judge a chance?
To the judge for a second, but do you have a sort of wrap up or?
Yeah, the wrap up is this. There is a lot that they could be doing to cut their budget that does not involve cutting needed services. Things like the capping ME-SALUD, their healthcare program, and so forth. But ultimately, they're not going to cut their way out of the problem. They're not going to tax their way out of the problem because there's nobody to tax except the people that you want to come there and produce businesses, so you can't tax them either. So what do they have to do? They have to grow the economy, and that's going to take a lot of time for one thing, and what it's going to really take is an investment in education that they currently are not able to make. We have to assist them to make, but every economy like theirs that was a developing island economy that is now an economic power in the world has gotten there by investing in education and technology. Puerto Rico is actually well positioned to do that. The K-12 system needs a lot of work, and we could spend an entire panel talking about that, but they actually have a very, very good university system, which is one reason they have a brain drain. They do a pretty good job of creating the brains, and they're more or less subsidizing them to leave the island right now. The cost of a college tuition is lower than a Pell Grant. So it's very easy to get educated and then leave. That needs to be turned around so that educated people and economic growth are going on in Puerto Rico. And that's basically what they'll have to get to. And
this is a perfect transition, I think. I know it took a long time to get to you, Judge Rhodes, but this statistic that 50 to 60% of the people are in poverty or qualify for Medicaid, I mean, this is just something I think everyone here should think about. Are we comfortable with that being a long-term issue? Are we comfortable, everybody here, with these people being in poverty, these American citizens being in poverty or qualifying for Medicaid for a really long time? And so Judge Rhodes presided over the Detroit bankruptcy. That was, there's obviously a debate of how that will play out over the long term, but seems to have at least gone through a lot of the problems, some of the similar issues that Puerto Rico is having. And one of the, I just want to frame it really quickly before I ask you what the additional similarities are, but there was a state with Detroit that provided some funding and at least some sort of legal clarity over that process. What do you, and so the government, the federal government, at least to a certain extent, is in a similar role here in terms of being able to provide a quick solution if everyone agrees that there should be one. But what are your thoughts about the similarities and differences? And you're on the ground advising Puerto Rico. What's going on there and how we can get a shorter solution as opposed to a prolonged one for a place that has so many people in poverty?
The similarities between what Detroit faced on the eve of its bankruptcy and what Puerto Rico is facing now are really quite striking. The primary similarity is that as Detroit on the eve of its bankruptcy, Puerto Rico cannot pay its debt. The government has said so, and there's really no analysis that suggests that assertion is not true. The second similarity, of course, is that neither can print money. And so, as with Detroit, Puerto Rico needs help. A third similarity is that, and this is based on my 30 years as a bankruptcy judge, in most cases of insolvency, there is no moral high ground as between debtors and creditors. There just isn't. For every dollar that a debtor borrows, knowing they shouldn't borrow it, there's a creditor willing to lend it, knowing that the debtor shouldn't borrow it. And we've seen a lot of that in Puerto Rico over decades. So there's no moral high ground in Puerto Rico, just as there was not in Detroit. Shared sacrifice has to be the primary motivation behind or policy behind solving the island's problems. The other primary similarity is the humanitarian crisis that Puerto Rico faces and that Detroit faced. Detroit had lost hundreds of thousands of its population, right? Its population went from 1.2 million to 700,000 over the course of decades. Its unemployment rate was outrageously high. And its economy suffered as well. And police, fire, EMS, streetlight, trash, snow removal, all of that suffered enormously. There was a humanitarian crisis facing Detroit, and it's coming right around the corner to Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is about to run out of money. Its pension plans are about to run out of money. It's 5% funded, not 5% underfunded, 5% funded, and when that money is run out, its pension payments to its retirees will have to be paid out of current income, burdening its budget that much further. So its ability to provide basic municipal services is about to be severely impaired, just as Detroit's was. Now, what's the difference? The difference is that Detroit had access to Chapter 9, and Puerto Rico does not at this point. And when I look at the future of Detroit, I mean, you all know the story. Its balance sheet has been fixed. Its budgets have been fixed. It is revitalizing itself, and it is restructuring itself. And its future looks very bright, very bright. People all over the country are rooting for Detroit, and it's fiscally actually doing better now than we had projected during the bankruptcy case in many ways. And I think Puerto Rico could have that future too. I really do. The debate seems to be about whether Puerto Rico should just get little Chapter 9 for its municipalities or big Chapter 9. And to me, that's a no-brainer. It's one economy. It needs a holistic solution. It needs an organized solution. These one-off settlements that take a year at a time, the island can't afford that amount of time. It just can't. And finally, I'll say that bankruptcy offers protections to creditors that these one-offs, one-at-a-time solutions don't. In bankruptcy, a bankruptcy judge will look at the plan, at all of the settlements, and decide whether they are fair and equitable, whether they unfairly discriminate against one another, whether they are feasible, whether they are in the best interest of creditors. These are the tests that the bankruptcy code imposes on settlements of insolvent debtors' debt. And that outside of bankruptcy, there's none of that. It's chaos. And creditors should want this. I frankly don't understand why they don't want this. But they should. So I see the potential for a bright future for Puerto Rico. Is Chapter 9 by itself a sufficient solution to its problems? Of course not. It wasn't in Detroit. And frankly, it wasn't for any of the millions of people who have filed bankruptcy. It's a part of the solution, but it's a necessary part of the solution.
I guess I have another question. Are there any other, we've gotten a lot of tools in the toolbox, and I think we have to wrap up in a moment. But one last question, and you can answer either one of these. Are there other tools in the toolbox for the policymakers and that we haven't addressed that you can think of that we should talk about? And then separately, a totally different question. Is the reason why there isn't urgency about Puerto Rico because it's slightly out of sight, out of mind? Is this a thing that DC, even Detroit, something that your everyday citizen doesn't. Let's focus on the second one because we don't have much time. We don't see Puerto Rico very much unless you're traveling there. Is that one of the problems here? Is that one of the reasons why there isn't the urgency, or that such a high, like I mentioned before, such a high statistic of poverty can persist without people reacting?
I think that's part of it, but I mean, maybe this is my whole experience showing. I think a lot of it is there just aren't any good choices, and I've never known politicians to rush toward making what I get bad or worse, and that's just something that most politicians would like to avoid. And so eventually, someone's going to have to choose bad or worse.
Teddy, since I think I already referred to your second question, I'm just going to mention a few points on your first question. I mean, I very much agree with Judge Rhodes' assessment. I do think that there are a few creative, innovative things that Congress and others can peel off and do right away that are part of some of the proposed plans. One of the great pieces of the White House plan is giving Puerto Rico access to Treasury's Office of Technical Assistance. That's the best kept secret in Treasury. Most of us have never heard of it, but essentially they work with countries around the world about getting their fiscal houses in order, how you do correct revenue raising, how you deal with budget transparency, which are all crucial issues that have to be a part of economic growth. So peeling off that piece and allowing Puerto Rico to have access to that already existing very good program would be great. I think, as also alluded to, dealing with the Medicare issue, there's ways that Congress and others can help ameliorate that. But I think also the energy issue is a very key issue beyond the Jones Act, which I also agree with, repealing that. But, one thing that Puerto Rico has a lot of is sun and wind. And the fact that they are doing energy and providing energy in such an inefficient way, when through a few law changes and some support, they could actually become an energy powerhouse in a very environmentally important way. So those three issues are ways that we can ameliorate the situation right away.
Judge Rose, Eric, any other?
Well, I just want to reemphasize that the fact that Congress makes Chapter 9 available either to the entities or to the Commonwealth as a whole does not mean that they will rush into bankruptcy immediately at all. It doesn't mean that at all. The politicians will still have to make the political decision that this is something that the island absolutely has to do as a matter of necessity. But if the Commonwealth and its entities do have access to Chapter 9, the creditors would be very smart then to come to the table with a real good faith effort to try to help the island solve its problems. Because, look, the debt is only as good as the economy will permit the Commonwealth to pay its debts. And when I look at Detroit, there's this myth that default and bankruptcy will forever ruin the entity's ability to go back into the market. Well, in August, just a few months after leaving bankruptcy, Detroit went back into the public market and borrowed a couple of $100 million at 4.4% and got an investment grade bond rating. It's a myth. It's a myth that bankruptcy or default will destroy Puerto Rico's ability to go back to the market.
I'll say two things real quick. One is, I think there's a lot of innovative solutions that could be done at the Commonwealth level in Puerto Rico, starting with the fact that half of the actual government budget is off budget in the form of parastatal corporations, essentially, some of which are very good, some of which are very bad. The bad ones are in the nature of any kind of government operation that's really going to operate at a loss, and that's just the way it is. But some of them could be profitable private businesses instead of unprofitable government businesses, essentially. And I think the government there needs to look seriously at selling them. But I would say that if they're going to do that, it shouldn't be a quick cash fix that then goes down the drain and disappears. They can use this to create an endowment that goes into lifting the educational levels long term in the Commonwealth, and that gets you back to the solution that I was talking about at the end about economic development. So I think there are a number of things that can be done that haven't been sufficiently put on the table. The second thing, to kind of tie together all the comments and bring it back to where this panel started, is, as I said, you're going to need some sheriff who locks everybody in the room, I think, and does some sort of a Camp David. It could be Treasury. It could be the Fed. I think that most likely it's going to wind up being a bankruptcy judge, and I nominate Judge Rhodes.
And that is what we did in Detroit.
And I think what he did in Detroit actually was phenomenal. I think we need somebody like him to solve the Puerto Rico problem. And as I said, that Winston Churchill said, eventually I think that's where we'll wind up. And thank God we have judges like Judge Rhodes.
Well, I can't thank you enough for joining us. It was a really enlightening panel, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. Or I'm going to actually have Bob come back up and make some final comments.
I want to thank all the speakers. An important issue, obviously, that policymakers are going to have to grapple with at some point. I want to thank the Capitol Forum for co-hosting, thank the live audience, grab a cookie on your way out, and everybody who watched on the live stream. The full event of this video will be on thehill.com this afternoon. Have a great day.